Okay, I'd like to welcome you two to the opening class tonight. We're going to go over an opening called the Ruy Lopez. It's spelled R-U-Y L-O-P-E-Z. It's named after a Spanish bishop from the 1590s. He was the first one. He wrote a book about it, actually. And it became very popular. It's considered the strongest opening for white, where both sides start with pawn to king 4, 2 squares in front of the king. So it's a very good opening to know. You know, there are only 2 American world champions, right? Bobby Fischer won it in 1972. He was considered America's best player ever. And when he was world champion, he was considered the best player in the whole world, and a lot of people thought he was the best player that had lived up to that point in time. But to be honest with you, they always say that about the world champion. He's always the best that ever was. So there have been lots of them. But there was only one other American who was world champion before him. Do you know who that was?
The gentleman that came up with the move that was...
Well, that was a Spanish bishop, Ruy Lopez. There was a guy from New Orleans back before the Civil War. In 1858, Paul Morphy was 20 years old. He was studying to be a lawyer. His dad was a judge. And his pastime was playing chess. He was a child prodigy. He learned by watching his father and uncle play chess. And one time they made an incorrect move, and he spoke up and told them that they'd made an incorrect move, and they couldn't believe it, so they checked it out, decided he was right, and then they taught him more formally how to play chess. But he picked it up just from watching them. Anyway, when he was 20, he was too young to be a lawyer. He had to be 21. So he got invited to the first United States Chess Championship in New York City, and he went up there, and he won the whole thing. And they played little matches against the other players. So he played a guy named Louis Paulson, who was a famous chess player also. And they played like 4 or 5 games, and Morphy won, and he played other guys, but that's how they did it. And he did so well, he won the tournament, that he got invited to go to Europe to play the European chess masters in England and France and Germany. Now, they didn't have very many formal tournaments back then, but they did matches. And each country had an acknowledged champion. So there was the champion in England, and then there were like 4 or 5 other really good players in England. They had a champion in France, Germany. The best player in Europe was a German named Adolf Anderssen. He was a school teacher, mathematics. But anyway, the guy who was nominally the best player in England was Howard Staunton. For whatever reason, he was the one that Morphy wanted to beat. And he was the reason Morphy went to England first. He tried to arrange a match with Staunton, and Staunton had said, "Come on up, we'll play." But when Morphy got there, Staunton got cold feet. He was older, he was writing books and other things. Apparently, he decided it would hurt his reputation if he played Paul Morphy and lost. So he kept putting the match off, and Morphy was playing all these other guys in England and beat them all. And then he got fed up with Staunton, who would never agree to a time for the match. He traveled over to France and beat the guys in France. And then the best player in Europe was in Germany, this Adolf Anderssen, and he traveled to France to play Morphy. And that was the best match Morphy had, because that was the best player. Anyway, they call him the first unofficial world champion because they didn't have a title then. But he was acknowledged to be the best player in the world after he wiped out all the European masters. Then he moved back New Orleans and tried to be a lawyer. And he gave up chess after that because he thought it was interfering with trying to be a lawyer. So anyway, it went on. But that's an interesting story. And he was the first and only American world champion till Bobby Fischer. And we had lots of contenders over the years. We had lots of really good players, but they weren't quite able to get to the title. But a lot of countries have good players, grandmasters, but they've never had world champions. So it's fairly common in chess. So anyway, tonight I'm gonna show you this opening of the Ruy Lopez. Now let's, you probably know the Italian game, right? Are you familiar with the Italian game? All right, let me show you how that goes, because we're gonna digress a little bit. This was the opening that was played before the Ruy Lopez became popular. When both sides start with the king pawn, it's called the double king pawn. The other main opening is you move the pawn in front of the queen 2 squares in black, and that's called double queen pawn. Now the double king pawn leads to the most interesting attacking. It's more interesting than pawn to queen 4. It turns out, see how neither pawn is protected? Mm-hmm. But if you move the pawn in front of the queen, the pawn's protected by the queen. It turns out that makes a big difference in the way the opening goes about. So pawn to queen 4 by both sides leads to a maneuvering game where it stays complicated. You don't trade many pawns or pieces, and they call it positional chess, where you're trying to put your pieces in the best squares, but there aren't that many direct kingside attacks. But pawn to king 4, because the pawns aren't protected, they get traded off, and it opens up files for the queens and the rooks and lines for the bishops. See how the pawns block the bishops initially? So you get a few of those pawns out of the way, and it opens up the whole board for the pieces, and that leads to really strong attacks and interesting defenses by black. So when people start to play chess, they always recommend to start with this, because you learn how to do attacking and defending chess. Later on, when you get better, then you migrate and start playing pawn to queen 4, and you start playing positional chess. So anyway, but grandmasters, of course, play all the different openings, but those are the two most popular starting moves, pawn to king 4 and pawn to queen 4. There's only 2 or 3 others that are considered good. The pawn in front of the queen bishop goes up 2 squares. Do you know what that opening's called?
No, we don't know any of the names.
That's called the English opening. Okay. It was popularized back in the 1800s by English players. So that would be this pawn moving up. See, it's kind of to the side of the board. And the sides in chess are called wings. And they're called flanks, like in an army, the side is the flank. So pawn to queen bishop 4 is called a flank opening. Whereas the pawns right in the middle 2 are called the center. Those are the standard openings. Okay, so now the Italian game. So anyway, first you start with a pawn, and it lets your bishop and queen out. And see, it's on the 4th row. This is white side, and this is black side. Now what you want to do is, you don't want to attack with just, say, a knight and a bishop. This bishop will come here in the Italian game and attack this pawn, only defended by the king. This pawn is the weakest position in black's starting position, because it's only defended by the king. A lot of beginners put the bishop here, and they move the knight here. They'll put the pawn here. It's a mistake to move the pawn here and block the bishop. Right. So you always get the bishop in front of the pawn, then you move the pawn up 1 square to make a pawn chain, and it protects your key center pawn. Then this bishop comes up and protects this square. So beginners like to bring the knight here and then move it up here. With the bishop here, they threaten knight takes pawn, attacking the queen and rook. Or they can do bishop takes pawn check, winning a pawn, and the king has to move to a bad square. And once the king moves, you can't castle, right? If the rook moves too, you can't castle either. You also can't castle through check or into check. So if this bishop was here, this pawn was gone, so this line is open, and the knight and bishop had moved somewhere. Black can't castle because the king would end up on a square that's check. But let's say this black bishop was here. See how it goes to this square? You can't castle through check. See, the king moves 2 squares and the rook moves here. You can't do that because there's a check on this square as you're moving this way. That's called, you can't castle through check. It'd be a bad move anyway. If you could do it, your rook would land on a square and the bishop would take it. The rook's worth more than a bishop. You guys know the value of the pieces. Here's how they do it. It's very simple. Because the pawn is the most worthless piece, but they're very useful, they give them arbitrarily a value of 1. Then they try to estimate how much each piece is in terms of how many pawns it would take to, if you lost it, you'd need, so a knight and bishop, you need 3 pawns. So they're a value of 3. A rook is a value of 5. A queen is a 9. A queen is worth 3, 2 bishops and a knight, or 2 knights and a bishop. That's the equivalent to a queen. Now 2 rooks would be 10 pawns or 10 points. They're worth a little, usually they're a little stronger than a queen. The king they don't give a value to because the object of the game is to checkmate the king. So you can't lose the king, so they don't bother giving him a value. But the interesting thing about the king, he moves 1 square in any direction, right? Now in the beginning you said you want to tuck him behind these pawns right here when you castle, right? So he's safe?
Yeah.
But after all the queens and knights and rooks are gone and it's just king against king, the king comes out of his little hole and tries to attack pawns. Then the king is powerful. And in an ending, let's say there's 1 knight on each side and the king is considered stronger than a knight and stronger than a bishop, even though they don't give it a value. So it must be worth at least 4 points.
Right.
Now, it's not stronger than a rook. Now, how do you think they decided that a bishop is 3 and a rook is 5? What do you think the difference is?
You can hide yourself from a bishop, but you can't hide from a rook.
Why can't you hide from a castle?
Because they can make it to every spot on the board within 2 moves if they don't have an obstruction.
Right, that's the key point. A bishop is stuck on only 1 color. So if you're a king and your opponent, white, only has a bishop that's on a black square, you just put your king on a white square. But the rook can go to anything. The other thing is, the bishops can only move on diagonals. The rook can do the whole file or a row. He can go to more squares. And it's more valuable to move on files and rows for attacking purposes. And like you said, to go from one point to another fast. So those 2 things combined, more squares, and they can go to every color, means they're worth more. Now the knight and bishop are worth approximately the same, but most grandmasters feel that most of the time bishops are a little stronger than a knight, but they don't give it any higher value. They don't give fractional points. Like they don't say the bishop's 3.25 and the knight's only 3. And then there are certain cases where the knights are stronger than bishops. So here's a case where the knight's stronger than a bishop. All the pawns are on the board. The bishops are blocked by the pawns, but the knight can hop over the pawns. So the knight can go, and the knight can go to any color square. It just takes longer because he moves in an L shape, only 3 squares at a time. But because he can go to any color square and hop over the enemy pawns and his own pawns, in that case, a knight is better than a bishop. But if you take off a bunch of pawns and you have a few left, the bishops have free run of the board, and they can move more squares, and the little knight's a little slow, you see. And the bishop is better then. So this comes out in the endgame. The endgame, you have the opening, right, when you start off, the middle game, and the ending. The ending is where you've traded off most of the pawns and pieces. You might have a knight and a king and a few pawns evenly balanced. Then it depends on who can attack and win a pawn who wins the game. And if neither side can, you need to win at least one pawn to win the chess game. If neither side can win a pawn, then it's going to be a draw. Now the reason a pawn is what you need is you eventually shove it up and promote it to a queen. And if you can do that, well, then you have a queen and it's easy to checkmate your opponent. So that's why a pawn is usually enough. But there are certain endings where where white's a pawn up and black just has a king and white has a pawn, but it's not automatically a win for white. So let's say this pawn is the only pawn and the white king is behind it and the black king in front of it. Turns out that's a draw. To win, the king has to be in front of the pawn, force the black king back. The pawn actually gets in the way of the king if the king's behind the pawn, and he can't force black back enough to win the game. So, just some background. All right, so the main thing you want to do is you do a pawn move just to kind of stake out your territory. Then you want to make piece, every move you move a different piece into play. That's called rapid development. It's like in an army. You can't start an attack against an opposing city or position until you get your troops from the city, you take them by train or plane to the front line, you organize it, you get the food, the equipment. So in chess, it's called mobilization or rapid development. So as we go through the particular openings, it's all about moving the pieces out as fast as you can. And white has the advantage of the first move because white gets to move first. Now black has to match white. If black doesn't match and falls behind, so white gets 3 pieces out and black only has 1, well, those 3 pieces can attack some point and black can't defend because he doesn't have his pieces mobilized and can't move them to defend the key pawn or whatever's attacked. So as we go through this opening, notice that every move by these grandmasters, they're bringing another piece or they're making threats. The ideal thing, you make a move with a piece and make a threat at the same time. If you make a threat, it forces your opponent, it reduces his freedom of movement. He has to defend the threat. If he has to defend the threat, there's only 1, 2, or 3 ways he can do that. See, you limit his moves. If he makes defensive moves and you're attacking as white, he can't attack you. You're safe. You know what they call that in chess? The person who has the move and is making the threat? The chess term is initiative, the initiator of the chess action. Okay, so here's the next move for white. The knight comes out to f3 and attacks the pawn that's not defended. That's the best move for white. It attacks the pawn. Black has to defend the pawn. So how can black defend the pawn? That's one way. There's other ways. What are the other ways?
Queen diagonally 1 spot.
The queen, yeah.
Bishop up 2
Yeah.
But
How about the knight? Can come out.
yeah, the other side knight. I was looking at the one.
Yeah. And the queen could go up 2 squares and protect it from this square, right?
Yep.
Here or here.
Yep.
Of course, it can't go here because the knight would take it. Now, do you guys know chess notation?
Numbers and
Yeah, numbers and letters. So it's right here. This is algebraic. The columns, they're called files, are lettered from A through H. And all the notation is done from the white point of view. Every square has a coordinate. The rows are 1 through 8. So this pawn move, see how it's on the E file? And it's on the 4th row? To write this down, the move is E. You do the file and then the square, the row 4, E4. That's this. And black moves his E pawn to this, which is the 5th row, again, coming up here. You see it right here. So this is E5. The thing is, when it's a pawn move, you don't have to put a P. It's understood if you don't write, like a knight is a capital N, and a bishop is a capital B, and a Q, capital Q, and an R, capital R for rook. So when it's a pawn move, you see, you don't have to write the P. But if you move one of the other pieces, you have to put the capital letter, knight, and then the square, F3. So the knight, the only knight that can go, this is F3. Only one knight can go there. This one goes to C3. Now let's say this knight had moved before and was here on D4. And this knight was back here. Now in that case, this knight could move here, or this knight could move here. It's ambiguous. You can't say N to F3 if it's ambiguous. You have to give the starting square. So if it's this knight, you would say knight G to F3. And if it was the knight here, it's on the D file, you'd say ND to F3. That's how. Now, captures, if you take, let's say black moved the pawn here and you do pawn takes pawn, that's with an X. And it would be E pawn X D pawn. EXD. Now, if this knight was here and this knight was here and knight took knight, it would be knight XN, NXN. Castles is circle dash circle. Castle queenside is 3 of them. So the notation you can follow is here on the right. And you see that they have the names of the grandmasters that played at the top. These were between Russians, Peter Swiveler, 2690, and Vasily Ivanchuk, 2711. They've been in the top 10 or 20 of the world for the last 25 years. This game was played way back in 2002, I think. It was a speed tournament, speed game. They call it rapid, so it wasn't a slow time. But I picked it out because it demonstrates the opening, and they're in the top 10 or 20 in the world. All right, so anyway, black has to defend the pawn, so he brings his knight to C6. Okay, now here's the characteristic move of the Ruy Lopez. The bishop comes out and has the potential to take the knight sometime in the future. Now the knight protects the pawn. When this bishop has the potential to take the knight in chess, they call that pressure. The bishop puts pressure on the knight. Now, if the bishop takes the knight, it's called a capture or an exchange. So at some point in the future, it doesn't work right now, but let's say white could make another move in a row. He kind of threatened, it looks like he threatens bishop takes knight, which defends the pawn, right? So you take the knight away, the pawn is undefended. This pawn takes. You wouldn't do this pawn because you do that this way, so you open the bishop line to the middle of the board and you open the queen line. If you took this pawn, you only opened a line this way, which isn't that good for the bishop, and the queen's still blocked by this pawn. Okay, so bishop takes knight, pawn takes, knight takes pawn. It looks like that's white's threat. So actually, this is the move that we're going to go through, pawn to queen rook 3. Now, if white tries to win that pawn, I'll show you what happens. So far so good. It looks like white won a pawn, doesn't it? But notice that the knight and the pawn behind the knight are unprotected. And black can win the pawn back simply by coming to this square, attacking two pieces. That's in chess, that's a double attack. It's very effective. The knight has to, you would give up the pawn before the knight. So the knight has to retreat. The best retreat is just to go back where it came from, threatening the queen, and then the queen takes the pawn, and white has nothing better than to trade queens, and it's a dead even game. So you see, there really isn't a threat yet of bishop takes knight, but in the future, it becomes a real threat. So that's kind of the idea that underlies the beginning of this opening. The Ruy Lopez is strong because it puts pressure on black's knight that defends black's key pawn, and as more pieces develop, white actually does threaten to take the knight, and it forces black to make pawn moves which weaken to some extent his position, and that gives white some possibilities, some possible ways to play in the future.
Can I say what I would do next if I was black?
What?
I would take the C2, or no, sorry.
E2.
No, I would take the C2 pawn.
Well, you'd have a hard time doing that because you would expose your king to a check.
Oh. Okay.
Your queen's pinned, as is white's.
She wouldn't realize that.
So there's nothing better than queen takes queen check, and white can't castle, his king's in the middle.
Yeah.
But without the queens on the board, you're not going to be able to checkmate him anyway. So it's a dead draw. It should be a dead draw. Okay. Anyway, going back, so when the pawn comes up, bishop takes knight doesn't work for white. And remember, I said the bishop's worth a little bit more than the knight. So the correct move is just to retreat one square, but keep attacking the knight. Now, that pawn gives black some possible move in the future. When white does threaten to take the knight and win the pawn, black will see that threat, and he can move this pawn here and drive the bishop away from the knight. The bishop has to retreat here. That's the reason this is a good move for black. So you'll see that come into play. Okay. Now this particular opening, black now plays move 4. He protects his key center pawn. Remember, the E5 pawn in this is very important for black from a defensive point of view. It's his center pawn. He wants to defend that at all costs. And even if white attacks it by, say, this pawn, you don't do pawn takes pawn. You maintain the pawn and you let white do pawn, and you take back, keeping a pawn on this square because it holds back the white pawn. And the pawn here keeps this knight from going to this square, and it would keep any white piece from going to this square because the pawn can take, of course, diagonally, right? Similarly, the white pawn affects this square, and black can't put pieces there. So these pawns kind of offset each other, and it maintains an equal position. They call that a balanced position in chess. That means it's an even position. Doesn't mean that the game's going to be a draw. It just means both sides have chances to win as the game develops. But if grandmasters play, they don't make any mistakes, it should be a draw. That's what balanced game is. Okay, now white's going to get his king out of the middle of the board and put it to safety and bring his rook to the center. So white castle, see how it's a little 0-0 symbol there, move 5. So that's how you write castle's king side. And queen side, you just put a dash and a 0, and it's 3, and that would mean queen side. Of course, neither side can castle queen side, but white can castle. Oh, I wanted to mention one thing. There is a drawback to this defense. It's called the Steinitz Defense Deferred, named after a former world champion named William Steinitz from Austria. He popularized this move. They knew there was a drawback to it. It blocks the bishop. See, the only square that bishop can go to is here. But black is defending anyway. And this pawn chain, this is called a pawn chain when you get 3 pawns linked up, is very strong defensive setup. So Steinitz felt that it was so strong, it offset the fact that he blocked the bishop. But white, of course, having the move, is very important to get that bishop in front. Otherwise, you wouldn't have any attacking chances. Anyway, oh, you guys know what a pin is, right? A pin. See how the bishop attacks the knight? And behind the knight is the king. You can't move the knight because it would expose the king to a check. That's called a pin. Like pinning a piece of paper on a notebook.
We know the move, we just didn't know what it was called.
Yeah, it's called a pin. Pin in chess is one of the most effective attacking. It's an attacking maneuver. It immobilizes your opponent's piece. This knight cannot move. Once you pin a piece, what you want to do is you want to shove this pawn to this square, attack the pinned piece, it can't move, and you could win the piece with pawn takes knight. Problem is, white doesn't have enough moves to do that. It takes 2 moves to go here. And if white moves here, black just takes it, and you never get the pawn here. So black's safe. But black's next move, he's going to break the pin. Do you know what break the pin means?
Attack the piece that's pinning him in?
No. You want to put a piece in this diagonal so the knight can move and there's no check on the king. So what's the move to break the pin?
Well, you're going to end up pinning your bishop there, I guess. But
Yeah, but the bishops just trade off. They exchange each other bishop for bishop. It's just a fair trade.
yeah.
So that's why black now breaks the pin, and now his knight can move and does once again defend the pawn, his king pawn on e5. Okay, now there are different ways to play this opening. In this game, white plays pawn to queen 4 right away. Another option is to play this pawn here first and then play the pawn here. That option has the advantage that if black does pawn takes pawn, the pawn here takes back, and you get 2 pawns in the center. And then you would, in fact, be able to attack the knight by pawn here and drive the knight back. That's an equally good opening. It's just, a lot of times in chess you have a choice between openings. They're both equally good. It becomes a matter of personal preference. So in this case, white decided not to play c3, but just play pawn to queen 4 right away. Okay, now black. Okay, so white has 2 knights out. I mean, a knight and a bishop out, 2 pieces, and castling is also a developing move. So white and the pawn, he has 2 pawns. Now black has 2 pawns in the center, the e5 and the d6. Now they're not as good as white's. White's 2 pawns are on the 4th rank, right? And this pawn is attacking this pawn. This pawn defends. This is an attack. Now this one can attack. Anyway, white has more space and is attacking, black is defending. That's because white gets the first move. And black has to defend patiently. Guess how many moves you have to defend before you actually get an equal position in chess?
I don't know, 3.
More like 15 to 25, depending on which opening is played. So some openings really take a long time for black. Those ones I was telling you about where the queen pawn and there's maneuvering. That takes sometimes 20 to 25 moves before it's even. Now these are quicker. King pawn, usually within 15 moves, it's pretty much resolved to an equal position. Or if black makes a mistake, then white gets an advantage, maybe not a winning advantage, but some kind of an advantage.
How do they decide who plays black? Because black obviously is at a disadvantage from the start.
One, in tournaments, let's say there are 100 people in the tournament. They rate it, everyone has a chess rating. They rank them by the highest to the lowest. They split the tournament in half. They take the 50 highest and the 50 lowest and match them up. So the highest guy in the tournament plays the highest guy in the bottom half. The poor guy in the bottom half gets killed. So after one round, he has 0, and the guy in the top has 1. Now let's just say there's 5 games to the tournament. Well, the guy that you don't get eliminated. Now, all the guys, second round, all the guys that won, let's say 50 of them won and 50 lost. The 50 that won, they separate it. The 50 that won get paired against each other. The top half of the 50 get paired to the bottom half of the 50. Now the ratings are closer together. The top players have to work harder to win the second game. Now the guy who lost, he gets paired against someone else who lost. Now he's playing lower rated players, and he has a better chance to get a win or a draw. So if you hang in there, you're likely to lose. If you're learning the game, you'll be in the bottom half of the tournament, but you lose to 1 or 2 really good players, and then you're going to play people your own level, and you have a very good chance of winning half of the games and maybe coming in with a 50% score, which is perfectly respectable when you're learning how to play. So that's how that works. And rating-wise, they take the difference in the ratings. Let's say I'm rated 2150, an expert rating. And let's say I'm playing a beginner that's about 1600, which is a B player. So my rating, there's 550 point difference. I should win that game statistically. Well, if I win the game, I only get like 3 or 4 rating points added to my rating. But if I lose that game, I may lose 30 or 35 points, and my opponent, because he beat someone so much higher rated, will gain 35 or 40 points. If you play somebody at your same rating, you may only trade 10 or 15 points either way. And if you have a draw, you get half of that. So that's generally, and they have this complicated mathematical formula that does all this, but the statisticians and mathematicians figured that out. I don't mess with it. But anyway, it is pretty accurate. So these guys, Vasily Ivanchuk, 2711, the world champion class players in the top 20, almost all are 2700 and above. Grandmasters start at 2550. A young college guy who makes grandmasters rated around 2500 to 2600. I'm a chess master. The chess master starts at 2200. Now I'm under that. I've lost a lot of rating points to these younger kids that get so good, you know, and they steal my rating points by beating me. It's not really fair, but just part of getting older. But anyway, so things even out in tournaments. So that's all I'm saying. Okay, so anyway, now black wants to develop another piece. Well, naturally, his knight hasn't moved on the king side or his black squared bishop. So which of those two pieces do you think he should move, the bishop or the knight?
The knight.
I agree, that's the right move. Why did you pick the knight?
Because the bishop really doesn't have much space to move.
Only one
Right,
square.
it can only move one square, and there's not much, once it gets there, there's not a lot of other space for it to go on its next move, whereas the knight is a pretty open board on that side.
That's true. And the knight move has a threat. What's the threat? What would be if black could make two moves in a row, what is black threatening after you move the knight to f6? Remember, it's a 3-move L shape. He can go up 2 squares and over 1 square from black's point of view to the right. He attacks the e4 pawn, doesn't he? Yeah. So you see, if you have a choice, again, you were right. The bishop is a lousy move, and the knight is it's better to get the knight out. You can always move the bishop later, and the knight, whenever you can make a move and make a threat, that's the move you want to pick. So that's the right move. Now, in this particular opening, white decided to take the knight, and black took back. Now, let's see what happens. This bishop and this knight are threatening to win this pawn that's unprotected. So I guess the threat would be bishop takes knight. You wouldn't do knight takes pawn. I mean, bishop takes pawn. You wouldn't do knight takes pawn. Why wouldn't you do knight takes pawn? If black could make an extra move. Why wouldn't you do knight takes pawn?
You're kind of blocking in your bishop.
Yeah, and this pawn might move up here, driving the bishop away, and the bishop protects the knight. If you do the bishop takes pawn, the pawn move doesn't attack anything, and the knight protects the bishop, and the bishop could take the knight if he should need to in the future. So black would have more possibilities by taking with the bishop. So that's the threat. Let's see what white does. Remember, white's castled, so now he brings his rook over to the middle of the board, and he defends this pawn here. Now, it's true that black has 2 pieces on the pawn, but it's also true that white can do pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and knight takes pawn. So if black wins this pawn, white wins this pawn. And this rook would be pinning the knight against the king. Once this pawn's gone and this knight moves, this knight would be pinned to the king. So it would be dangerous for black to take the pawn, opening the rook file toward his king. So I'm sure, well, let's see what happens. Okay, black is not foolish enough to take the pawn, opening the rook on his king. He's going to develop that bishop we talked about. So you see, usually you develop your knights and bishops before you mess around with the rooks. Well, first of all, before you can castle, you got to move the knight and bishop out of the way, right? On either side. So it makes sense that you move your knight and bishops out before you castle or move the rook. So that's the right move. He moves his bishop to e7. Now, white is going to develop, and he has a knight and bishop that haven't moved yet. Why don't you take a guess as whether the bishop or the knight should move?
The bishop.
Where would you put the bishop?
Yeah, she said G5.
Yeah, you could go to G5.
I was going to say E3.
Well, E3 has a problem. E3, the only thing protecting this pawn is what?
Right.
Is this. And if you move here, you blocked this from protecting the pawn, and he could just snap it with bishop takes pawn.
Yeah.
So bishop here is an acceptable move. It's not the best move, though. What does the bishop threaten here?
Everything.
Does he threaten bishop takes knight?
Yeah.
But I told you the bishop's better than a knight. And the other bishop then gets a better square, comes up from the second row to the third row where it protects the king pawn. So the bishop move doesn't really threaten anything. Now don't forget, once black castles, then he will threaten bishop takes pawn. It's only defended once. It's attacked twice. The knight move has the advantage of, remember, the knight's a little slower, so they often move the knights before the bishops, because the bishops can move to a good square in one move. It takes the knight a couple squares to advance into black territory. But in this case, the knight move also protects that king pawn a second time, stopping the black threat. So the knight move is the right move. Okay. Now, white is actually threatening to win that pawn here by pawn takes, knight takes pawn, because his pawn's defended adequately. Because of this threat, black now feels he has to give up his center pawn for this pawn. So that's what he does. See how it says E takes D4? Remember our notation? The E pawn takes the D4 pawn. Now, naturally, the knight takes back and threatens the bishop. Now, if white could make two moves in a row, white would take the bishop. It's worth more than the knight. And this pawn would have to come here. Now, these pawns, one in front of the other, there's a word for those in chess. Do you know what that is? Double pawn. So anytime the pawns, see, the pawn here blocks this pawn, doesn't it? Double pawns are weak in chess. You want to avoid double pawns if you can. Sometimes you can't. Now, there is a plus to double pawns. See how this, if this pawn was here, see how it can't be, there's no pawn here or here? This pawn can't be protected by another pawn. It has to be protected by a piece. So if white could get his queen here, say, it would threaten queen takes pawn, and you would tie black. He would have to defend by moving his queen up to protect a pawn. And do you really want to tie your queen up protecting a lousy pawn? You don't. Double pawns are weak. But they do have one advantage. If the pawn was here, it guards this center square. This knight could not move here because the pawn guards this square. So double pawns have a plus and minus to it. The minus is they're weak and can be attacked, and they're not defended by other pawns. The positive is it was a B pawn way back here in the second. Now it's a C pawn on black's third row, and it guards the key center square. That tends to offset each other. All right. Anyway, black, he doesn't want to give up his bishop. He doesn't want double pawns. He retreats the bishop. Coincidentally, this knight was threatening to hop here. This square was unprotected. The bishop move protects this square, and if the knight were to come here now, black would take the knight, and look who gets double pawns, white. And the double pawns would be bad for white, so he's not going to move his knight there. Not for quite a while, anyway. Now, this bishop here could come here and attack the queen. This knight could come here and then come back to this center square. White doesn't want either of those to happen. So he makes a preventive pawn move. Remember I said you should develop your pieces before your pawns. So if you follow that rule, you'd move this bishop. Now you could move to the square you suggested right here, because the pawn's defended by the knight, and it doesn't matter that the rook's blocked, because the pawn's defended. Or you could move the bishop here. But again, the bishop here doesn't really threaten anything. But white chose to make it what's called a preventive pawn move. He moves the pawn here, and see how it guards this square? So the bishop and the knight can't go here. So it's an acceptable move in this situation is to disregard the general rule of an opening that you always move your pieces and you don't make pawn moves. In this case, it's a decent pawn preventive move, so it's acceptable to violate that general rule. White plays h3. Now, black got all his minor pieces. He's ready to castle and bring his rooks to the middle, so black castles. And white's not sure where he wants that bishop to go yet. So he actually develops his queen. And in this case, he puts it here. Now this is a good square for the queen. It can't be attacked by any black pieces because the only attacking square would be here, and that pawn move prevents that. The knight is attacking white squares but can't attack the queen. The queen is going to protect this square. Apparently white wants to move the knight here. The knight here would attack this bishop and this pawn, and the queen protects it. So if the bishop took the knight, white wouldn't get double pawns. He could take with the queen. Then he would have gotten a bishop for a knight. He would be happy that he got a better piece for his knight. And he didn't get double pawns. That's why he went queen to f3. He'll develop this bishop later on when it becomes better, more clear to him whether the bishop should go here or there or there or there. So he's holding that in reserve. Okay. Black makes a minor mistake here. He plays his pawn here. Now, every time you make a pawn move, it has plus and minuses. Every pawn move creates weak squares around the pawn where the pawn was. When this pawn was here, see how it guarded this square? And it guarded this pawn. So this pawn was rock solid. It's very safe to have a pawn protected by another pawn. That's a little pawn chain. Now the pawn moved here, so this square is no longer protected by a pawn, see? This black square. And this pawn's no longer protected by a pawn. This pawn is now a little weak, weaker than it was. It is protected by the bishop, so white's not going to win it right away. But in the future, white can move this bishop here. See how it would attack the pawn? He might move his queen here. Bishop and queen would then threaten bishop takes pawn. He can swing this rook over here, attacking the pawn from here, move the knight over here to get out of the way of the rook. Then he might have the bishop and the queen and the rook, and black might lose his key pawn. That's why this is a minor mistake. But there's a positive to it. The pawn moved here and now protects this key center square, and the knight can't move up here. Plus and minus, but on the whole, it's a minor mistake because it weakened this key pawn, which more than offsets the gain he got from protecting this square. All right, so now white knows where to put his bishop. He has a target. He's going to target that weak pawn on d6. So he immediately attacks the pawn. Now black rather than, he develops his queen, he counterattacks by bringing his queen along this diagonal. What is the queen attacking from this square? This pawn. Notice that when the bishop moved here, it left this pawn unprotected. Black said, well, you might win this pawn, but I'm going to threaten this one. And if this pawn moves here, when the pawn is here, it protects the knight and this square. If the pawn moves here, the knight is not protected by a pawn, and the queen would have to protect it. That would give a target for the queen and maybe that black squared bishop of attacking this knight at some point. The other thing, the queen coming up here, this rook can slide over here behind this bishop. The bishop can move back, then the rook and bishop protect the pawn, and black thinks that's adequate defense. We only have a few more minutes, so we're not going to get through this game, but I wanted to explain the opening principles to you. Okay, now, what is the one piece that white is still in its original position from white's side? Yeah, where do you think he should? So that's the obvious piece that should be moved. Where do you think white should move it? Yeah. Right here, yeah. You wouldn't move it behind the pawns, it would have no future. But this is a great square attacking that pawn like we talked about and protecting the knight at the same time, because there is queen takes knight as a threat. Okay. Now, black could take this pawn. I don't know what this is, but we're about done. Anyway, taking this pawn might not be such a hot idea. It would attack the knight, but the knight is defended by the queen. You see that? So it doesn't threaten queen takes knight, and the queen can be attacked by what rook move?
The queen, you said the queen?
The black queen, if the black queen took this pawn,
Yeah.
it can be attacked by a white rook. What's
Right. Going back to B from that.
And where does the queen go?
Probably
The only square is here, but look what's undefended.
Right.
White would get this pawn, and the rook would be attacking black's back row and hitting this bishop. White would be better because white's attack with the rook is better than black's queen doing nothing over here. So black will not take that pawn. Not yet. So black is going to develop one of his rooks to the middle, just like white did, and in this case he does the A rook. And we'll just do a couple more moves. I'm going to show you, white made not the best move here. He starts an attack with his kingside pawn. Now remember I told you these pawn moves weaken squares. So the pawn was here, it protected here and here. Moving up here, this pawn now can't be protected by a pawn. So this square and this square are weak, and this square and this square are weak. See the squares around where the pawn moved to. But there is a threat. White wants to shove the pawn up here and drive the knight back. It's an attacking move. In this case, it's a dubious move by white. Now, my computer said, oh, the computer programs are so good now, they're better than the world champion. And my program is called Komodo. That's just the name of the people came up with after a dragon. You know, the little dragon, that's their emblem. Anyway, it says white should have played queen here, protecting the knight. And let's see what else. We'll just run through this. Black would play pawn up to c5, driving the knight away from the center of the board. The knight retreats. You only retreat in chess when you're forced to. So don't voluntarily retreat. But in this case, he retreats and the knight protects the other knight. So this knight protects this knight, And the knight can re-enter the game by coming up this way. So it's it may take a couple moves, but the knight is still in the middle of the board and can re-enter the game very quickly. Now black develops his other rook behind there. It protects the bishop, and the rook is lined up on the queen and on this pawn, and the bishop can move back, and then black will counterattack with the knight and rook on this pawn and also keep this pawn from advancing. So that's why they did that. Now white plays pawn to bishop 3, so he finally had enough of the queen takes pawn possibility, so he stops it forever with this move. Now black, now that the queen has no longer attacking the pawn, he moves the queen here where it attacks the knight. It doesn't threaten to win the knight, but it does tie down the queen and the knight. At least one of these two pieces has to stay here and protect the knight. So it got the queen to a square, it attacks this knight, and it ties down at least one of these two pieces. And then white, oh, I told you the knight can re-enter the game. He comes up here, and at some point he can come back up here, and he protects this pawn. And the computer says that white has a slight advantage. Anyway, we'll end here. This is, again, the Ruy Lopez. This is the Steinitz Defense Deferred. And we went over the main opening principles of rapid development, controlling the center with your pawns and your pieces. Okay, thanks. Thanks for coming.